The furore over the VIP protection unit members assaulting unarmed civilians is not dying down. We are speaking to the Democratic Alliance's Shadow Minister of Police. Welcome, Mr. Andrew Whitfield.
Thank you for having me.
We haven't previously asked for your comments on that incident. Please may we have that now?
Certainly. Well, I think that I speak on behalf of every single law-abiding South African when I say that, I was completely shocked, but beyond that, very, very angry that the people who are employed to protect us are committing the most violent crimes against us. We know that police brutality has become a culture within the South African Police Service. We saw this during the COVID-19 lockdown. The DA monitored hundreds of cases of police abuse and brutality. We were in daily contact with the Independent Police Investigative Directorate. And to see such graphic footage of South Africans being kicked and beaten unconscious by South African Police Service members is a massive wake-up call to all South Africans that this current government that is presiding over this culture simply cannot be allowed to be given another 5 years in office. I cannot imagine it's going to get better unless we see some fundamental political change in South Africa that reinstates a new culture of policing based on honesty, transparency, and most importantly, on professionalism.
I understand that there's been a death threat to an ex-cop in the security industry for sharing footage of the Blue Light Mafia's assault last week. May I read the message? Good day. We don't take kind to the footage that you supplied to the media. You made a lot of enemies in specialized units. We will deal with you. May I have your comment on that, please? Is there any way that you can take this further?
Well, it's completely outrageous. I believe that there's been a huge amount of interest from civil society in terms of taking this issue forward. We will certainly be raising it with the Minister to make sure that the police do investigate as they have committed to do and track and trace that contact number and make sure we find out who's responsible for such a horrible example of intimidation where South Africans have now been able to see the kind of police brutality that probably takes place on a daily basis because somebody took a video and uploaded it online. That is transparency. We've not seen the same from the South African Police Service. We've not seen the Minister in the last 7 days coming out to condemn, to speak out. He's not taken the lead on this issue. He's gone underground. And so the Minister at this point is complicit in everything that we're seeing at the moment. The secrecy, the intimidation, the kind of violent brutality that we've seen in the South African Police Service has increased under his watch. And so I think what this demands is for the Minister to come out very strongly and to ensure South Africans that this kind of intimidation of effectively what is a whistleblower blowing the lid on this kind of police brutality, that these people will be protected, then that the people who committed the intimidation will be arrested. Unfortunately, at this stage, it appears that SAPs doesn't have the kind of appetite or urgency to deal with the matter expeditiously.
People are asking, why is the Minister of Police still in his job? How does he keep that job?
Well, the best person to answer that question is the President who appoints him. I can only imagine that it has something to do with internal ANC politics because on almost every single metric, the Minister is failing. Violent crime is up across all violent crime categories by over 40%. We've got up to 27% of police vehicles and visible policing and detective services in provinces like the Eastern Cape being unoperable or broken down in the garages. We have an increase in the culture of police brutality, as I've touched on, and the Minister is really simply not fit for purpose. So the President ultimately has to take responsibility for the state of safety and security in the country because he seems to think that the Minister is doing a good job. I think it would be best placed to get the President to explain why he believes that Minister Cele should stay in that job. I haven't met a single South African who believes that he's doing a good job, and we have certainly engaged the President on a number of occasions to challenge him to replace the Minister of Police so that we can have some hope of turning this culture of police brutality as well as incompetence, which is led by the Minister himself, so that we could turn this around. The President, unfortunately, appears dead set on keeping Minister Cele in this position, And as long as Minister Cele remains there, I'm afraid our safety and security environment will deteriorate.
During your engagements with the President on this issue, what kind of feedback did you get from him, or was he just dead set against the submission?
Well, we've written to the President, we've submitted questions, we've challenged him in Parliament, we've made public calls for Minister Cele to go. We've had no formal responses to our formal correspondence, but the President does go out in public. He's gone out in public and he said that the minister's doing a good job. It's just completely confusing, I think, to the South African public that the President can stand up without any evidence to say that Minister Cele is doing a good job. We've seen violent unrest in the last couple of years. We've seen police brutality increase. We've seen the inability of South Africa's police services to contain violent unrest. And all the while, Minister Cele parades in front of TV cameras, attending events and funerals, but never actually getting into the bowels of the South African police service and instituting the reforms that are actually required to build an honest and professional police service that South Africans deserve.
Well, that is not the only scandal that has hit the South African police recently. There's also the issue of it being in possession of illegal spying equipment. Could you please enlighten us what that is all about?
Well, in order to intercept communications, South Africans may be aware of a legislation called RICA. All South Africans are required to comply with RICA, cell phone companies, etc. And the state is given exemption or certainly given permission by a judge, which is known as a RICA judge, to intercept communications in a legal sense in order to apprehend criminals or to obtain evidence in crime syndicates or anything of that sort of nature. It has now come out through a parliamentary question, which my colleague Oki Tablanche has asked in Parliament, that the South African Police Service has been making use of spy grabber technology without the appropriate exemptions to use that technology from the Minister of Justice, and also potentially without the correct permissions from the RICA judge, who would have to sign off on these interceptions. And this is an incredibly serious issue, and I don't think that it's been met with the kind of outrage that we would expect. We need to make sure that we identify examples of when that took place and hold the relevant people accountable. And so my colleague and I in Parliament will be conducting an investigation and submitting further questions to obtain more information. I believe we're going to be pursuing a Promotion of Access to Information Act application in order to obtain the details surrounding these interceptions over many years, which were done illegally on South African citizens, including journalists.
How far back does this go that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of exactly when it started, but I suspect it's been ongoing for a very long time. There was an article in the Herald newspaper in the Eastern Cape a couple of years ago, which effectively told the story of how politicians' phone calls were intercepted in the 2016 local government elections. And so, it certainly goes back almost more than likely at least a decade, perhaps even more. Minister Cele was the National Police Commissioner around 10 years ago, and so I suspect that it may have even started then. The minister should have known that he's not allowed to use this technology. He was recently, in fact, in Parliament, granted the exemption by the Minister of Justice, but it's too little too late for those illegal interceptions which were conducted by the police. And we now need to get to the bottom of this. We need to ensure that there's a proper investigation, and we need to hold those accountable, those people who made use of that technology to illegally intercept communications from ordinary South Africans.
So it was not just a case of the police being in possession of this equipment. It was also a case of the police using this equipment illegally to spy on citizens and opposition politicians and journalists without the necessary legal authorization. Absolutely.
The RICA judge herself has, in the past, and it's been well publicized in the media, she has herself raised concerns about illegal interceptions where applications are made to her office, but the wrong cell phone number, the correct cell phone number is used, but the motivation around it has been fabricated. And so I think that there are still loopholes within the legislation that need to be tightened up. We also know that it's very easy to obtain SIM cards So from a law enforcement point of view, the RICA Act is not being enforced properly on the one end, but also on the other end, from the state, it's not being adhered to properly. And I cannot imagine why the South African Police Service would go rogue and illegally intercept communications from South Africans unless it was for political purposes, especially journalists. And so that is why we are taking it so seriously and will be investigating this matter through Parliament.
So if one suspects that you have been illegally put under surveillance, electronic surveillance, how could one go about trying to confirm that?
Well, I think it would be very difficult. I mean, how would you know that you're being intercepted if you suspect that you are? I mean, it would be useful to perhaps write to the RICA judge to see whether the correct authorizations were provided. I mean, the first thing I would do is I would go to a lawyer to make sure I didn't make any legal mistakes along the way, make sure that the RICA judge and every other party, including any ombudsmen in that process, are aware that we are taking it seriously. I would make sure that I fight to get the evidence that I was being illegally intercepted. And if that was the case, I would then have to demand consequences. But it would be very difficult, I imagine, to know whether you were being, your communications were being illegally intercepted unless you got tipped off or unless you had a real burning suspicion, especially as a journalist. I mean, I think that journalists are very tuned in to the political situation in South Africa. They tuned in to all sorts of things, and they would have probably valid suspicions in some instances that would require follow-up.
Thank you very much. That was the Democratic Alliance's Shadow Minister of Police, speaking to BizNews about criminality, illegality, and abuse of power in the South African police. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield.